Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at Capcom's newly released entry to the long-running Monster Hunter series, Monster Hunter Rise, and see how it stacks up both visually and from a gameplay perspective to the previous entry to the series, Monster Hunter World. Now before we begin, bear in mind that Monster Hunter World released over 3 years ago, and was first only available to play on the PS4 and Xbox One family of consoles. That game has since released on the PC platform, where players have been able to crank up the visuals far beyond the capabilities of the console versions before it, while also enjoying the benefits of things like unlocked frame rates and the ability to fine-tune settings based on their hardware capabilities. Monster Hunter Rise, however, is a brand new game, built exclusively for the Nintendo Switch platform. The Switch is of course not nearly as powerful as the other consoles, and especially not as powerful as the PC that I'm using here. So while I'll still be comparing various assets like character models, environments, and effects, this is not in any way supposed to be any analysis of which platform is better, but rather an observation of what techniques Capcom has employed in order to circumvent these obvious technical hurdles, and how it has impacted both the visual design and overall art direction of the experience. Additionally, I want to point out some of the biggest changes that Capcom has introduced to the general gameplay, including new mechanics, adjustments, and other quality of life features. So let's kick this comparison off by first briefly going over the changes that were made to the visual design, starting with some general information about the resolution and performance. Now, when it first released, Monster Hunter World was only available on either the Xbox One or PlayStation 4 console platforms, with the base versions being stuck at around 900 to 1080p at 30 FPS. The mid-gen upgrades like the PS4 Pro and One X featured options to prefer performance, resolution, or graphics, none of which ever achieved an actual native 4K output or a stable 60 FPS average. It wasn't until the more recent PC release that Monster Hunter World was finally able to achieve those lofty goals, and assuming your hardware is up to the task, it runs beautifully with frame rates far exceeding 60 at 4K. Fast forward to this latest release, and we're of course going to see some limitations due to the Switch's less powerful components. Monster Hunter Rise currently only maxes out at around 720p when the system is in its docked mode, or 540p when played in portable mode, and the frame rate is instead targeting a locked 30 FPS. It's a pretty noticeable drop down if you're used to playing Monster Hunter World with all the bells and whistles, but thankfully, it's not a deal breaker. Rise's locked 30 FPS feels remarkably solid, with rarely any dips in performance, even during some of the most intensive sequences. With 4 players all smacking a monster with lots of particle effects, the game continues to maintain its steady frame rate, which is critical in keeping the action feeling responsive and manageable. It's not perfect, and I occasionally found it will dip when rounding corners, especially during the daytime, but it's more or less a stable experience. Moving on, let's take a look at how the character models have changed. Now, despite being rebuilt using the RE engine, Monster Hunter Rise looks remarkably similar to Monster Hunter World. The general aesthetic of its various characters and creatures are practically indistinguishable, and all the movement and animations line up about the same as well. The only real artistic distinction between the two games is the much more feudal Japan inspiration that went into the various clothing and armor designs of Monster Hunter Rise. Whereas a lot of Monster Hunter World's characters look like they're some sort of highly advanced tribe of cavemen. That's not to say that all the old armor designs are gone. In fact, you can even craft the default hunter armor from Monster Hunter World if you like. But the new character skins and outfits built specifically for Rise will have a bit more of a Japanese influence in their designs than before. We'll see a lot more of this with the environments as well, but before we get to that, it's important to note that the actual quality and complexity of the characters has also seen a slight reduction with Rise. The poly counts for most characters has been dropped substantially, with rigid edges being more apparent, and the texture maps and shaders used are similarly more simplistic. However, because of Monster Hunter's stylized art direction, this isn't quite as noticeable as you'd think. And I was surprised to find some really nice looking effects like fur shaders still intact to some degree, which is most noticeable when dealing with some of the larger hairy monsters, or speaking with any of the game's palicos. Again, it's not going to look as good as equivalent character models in Monster Hunter World, but it's better than I anticipated going into this. Moving on, we have the environments. Here we see a really clever use of space in order to circumvent the need to populate the world with all the detail that we saw in Monster Hunter World. There was a lot of great variety in the last game, from the jungles along the beaches to the large desert canyons and crystallized caves. And they're all beautifully detailed, with vegetation populating practically every inch of their environments. But these levels are also very densely packed and somewhat claustrophobic in their design. Almost every arena intended to fight monsters in feels noticeably small, with things like ladders, swings, and vines all contributing to a somewhat confusing image. Monster Hunter Rise brings the series back to its roots a little bit, with much larger open spaces that simultaneously circumvent any need for complex environmental decor. Vegetation is still present, but it's toned down a good amount, with dynamic 3D grass like this being spread out thinly, and barely reacting to the player as well. Whereas in Monster Hunter World, this grass is incredibly thick in some areas, and can even be used to hide from monsters. Monster Hunter Rise also changes up the artistic style of the environments as well. As I mentioned briefly before, Monster Hunter World had a little bit of a prehistoric/caveman feel going for it. A lot of the structures in the hub area are built from giant monster bones and wrecked galleons, and there's almost no sign of human civilization when you venture off into the actual monster-infested wildlands. But Monster Hunter Rise feels like you're trekking through the thick forested regions of Kyoto, with lots of pagoda-style structures, old abandoned ruins, and plenty of bamboo stalks bordering the paths. There's even a big snowy biome that I don't believe was introduced into Monster Hunter World until its paid expansion a few years later. Another big change is the general layout of these levels. Monster Hunter World's various environments are pretty big, with tons of sectors all connected by various interweaving paths, with a bit of verticality thrown in here and there. But Monster Hunter Rise feels a bit smaller in its overall scale. Sure, the level arenas are much wider, and the paths feel longer, but each level environment is roughly half the size of the environments in Monster Hunter World. To make up for this, Rise offers some more verticality to its level structures, which takes full advantage of the new traversal mechanics that I'll expand upon more in a bit. Next, we have the lighting. Now, this is something that Monster Hunter Rise unfortunately can't match in quality. The lighting in Monster Hunter World was already pretty hit or miss, with some scenes looking fantastic while others looked weirdly washed out, often featuring an excessive amount of bloom. Rise doesn't suffer from the abundance of bloom, but the image often feels really drab and unappealing. You won't get any bright greens, reds, and blues here, but rather a sea of brown with the occasional pink and orange. If you're familiar with Monster Hunter's general look and feel, then this shouldn't come as any surprise. However, the removal of more advanced effects like the volumetric lighting, the lack of dynamic time of day in the village hub, and the lackluster shadowing puts Rise at a noticeable disadvantage, which is only exacerbated further when looking at the effects. Monster Hunter games rely heavily on their visual effects to translate to the player all the different elemental blights and impacts during hectic battles. Monster Hunter World in particular cranked up the amount of visual noise substantially, with tons of particles, flames, and other interesting elemental powers flooding the screen. But one problem I've always had with World was how minimal some of its impacts felt when swinging swords into monsters. The exaggerated blood splatter that would occur in older entries was removed, and with the exception of the noise feedback and numbers popping up on screen, it wasn't quite as clear that the player had managed to land a hit successfully. With Monster Hunter Rise, the cartoonish blood splatter effects have returned. Those extra particle effects from things like healing powders and fires have been toned down to save on resources. Now, let's move on from the graphics and talk about some of the biggest changes that have been made to the gameplay design. For players of Monster Hunter World, and similarly many of the past entries to the series, Monster Hunter Rise feels practically identical in terms of its general controls and UI. The overall premise of the game remains accepting contracts in a hub area, traveling to one of the several open-ended environments, and hunting down specific monsters. But not everything featured in Monster Hunter World was carried over. Tracking monsters, for example, is simplified so that you no longer need to follow fireflies or discover any clues, and you can easily just follow them using the minimap instead. Rise also does away with the slingshot tool, making players throw items like flash bombs by hand again. But despite these few features that have been removed, Rise does add in some major game-changing features in their place. One of the biggest changes, for example, are the new Palamutes. Palamutes are a sort of stretched out looking dog that will accompany the player wherever they go, and can even be ridden across the game worlds. They also serve a critical role in combat, and will fight alongside the player with various weapons and abilities, and can even latch on to monsters in some instances. Just like the Palico Cats, which yes are still in Rise, the Palamutes act as a extra AI controlled ally, and will often distract monsters, giving players just enough time to heal or sharpen their blade mid-fight. And because Palicos also follow the player, playing Monster Hunter Rise in single-player mode has never been easier. Another big change introduced with Rise is the new wire bugs mechanic. In Monster Hunter World, level environments occasionally had some areas where you could swing across gaps using glowing beetles called wedge beetles. Rise expands on this concept with the wire bug, that can be used to swing across any gap that the player wants, and can even be chained together with wall runs to reach even higher locations. There's still areas where more scripted wire bugs can be used to reach really high ledges, but more often than not, the game requires players to choose their own routes to objectives, and experiment with different wire bug maneuvers. The wire bug also serves a critical role in the combat, as it can be used to thrust players into the air for a downward strike, and more importantly, can be used to quickly recover from being knocked down, avoiding any devastating follow-up attacks that would have otherwise killed the player. Another cool new feature in Rise is the ability to ride wyverns. Every now and again, two monsters will enter the same arena together, and will immediately start to fight each other. During this time, players can jump onto a stunned monster and take control of them, which will zoom the camera out and give the player options to evade or attack, with the goal of dealing some massive damage to a target. It's a little clunky, but it can be an absolute lifesaver when dealing with the more difficult monsters, and can help to speed up the process a good amount. Monster Hunter Rise also reworks how the smaller creatures in the world behave, most notably the endemic life forms. In Monster Hunter World, there were several small life forms moving around the various biomes, and aside from giving the world a more living, breathing feel, they didn't really offer much to the player. But now, all these small creatures offer specific buffs to the player, like temporary damage boosts, extra defense, or items. They can even be picked up while riding on your Palamute, which can make the long journeys to and from monsters a bit more interesting. There's a bunch of other smaller changes in Monster Hunter Rise, like weapon balancing tweaks and a slightly easier multiplayer connection process. But for now, let's move on to a sound comparison. Which game do you think has the superior audio quality and design?
Hey!
And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Monster Hunter Rise is a surprisingly solid follow-up to the excellent Monster Hunter World. Sure, the visuals aren't the same caliber, which was fully expected because of the hardware being used. But the smart choices that the developers made with the level design and art style helped to minimize this change to a great effect. And when playing on a small portable screen, the differences will likely not be all too noticeable for most anyway. it genuinely feels like a portable Monster Hunter World sequel, with most of the great improvements that game introduced, along with many of its own great additions. The Palamutes speed up traversal significantly, and the wire bugs are a much more interesting mechanic than the wedge beetles from before. And the slightly simpler online multiplayer system, combined with the faster progression, help to improve the beloved monster hunting formula. But what do you guys think? Do you think Monster Hunter Rise is an improvement when it comes to its gameplay? I still prefer the way that Monster Hunter World plays. And what do you think of the visual changes that Capcom made? Let me know in the comment section, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this posted every week.